Welcome to #Sexy Authors Podcast, a podcast about very important books and the people who write them, centering more specifically underrepresented communities such as sexual minorities, giving them a space to amplify their voices, their messages, bringing very important information to the forefront. In a time of banned books and worldwide chaos, #Sexy Authors hopes to offer intellectual refuge, respite, and connect you with these very important books. Hosted by sex therapist and author Moushumi Ghose, licensed marriage and family therapist.
Hello and welcome back to the #Sexy Authors podcast. I always forget the hashtag, but I'm like, when I named the podcast, I'm like, it's got to have the hashtag in front of it. I don't know, maybe that ship has sailed, but that's what it's called. Today, I'm super excited to bring back a friend of mine who actually was on this very YouTube channel. I think that's how we met over a decade ago. Because you had written another book. She had written another book. And back then this channel was The Sex Talk. And the book that she had written back then was Sexy Feminism with Heatherwood Rudolph. And so today let's welcome Jennifer Keishin Armstrong. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So glad to have you back.
Yes. That was what? I mean, I think that book came out in 2013. So that's 11 years ago.
Yep, that was 2013 because it was in the Bay Area and I moved to New York in 2014. Yes. So, and in New York, when I moved to New York, where Jennifer lives, or Jen used to live in the city, we co-hosted a rock and roll poetry night in the East Village for like a year and a half or something.
Yeah, it was really fun. I was just saying off air that I still miss it. I liked kind of knowing our scene there and met some cool people that way. And I don't know, it's just really cozy and nice and
got to perform every month.
Yeah, it was really, really fun. And for me, that was the first, that was sort of how I got into open mics, and because I was a little nervous that, I just do like amateur acoustic covers of pop songs. Who wants that? But it was so much fun. And also, I don't know, I find it kind of even probably a little bit relevant to this podcast that what a beautiful expression of creativity and also bravery, I think. And I'm so used to, as an author, I'm a professional author and writer, and I have been really since I was a teenager, not an author, but like a journalist. Yeah. And so that it doesn't feel scary to me. It doesn't, it really mostly, I'm sure we could find a way that it would feel scary to me again, but most of what I do, it's not like a big creative risk or whatever. Whereas, I guess it kind of is. I just don't think of it that way anymore. You know what I mean? I've become really numb to that because otherwise I'd never do my job if I was worried about putting a book out there. Whereas it makes me very nervous to play guitar in front of people still. And I've been playing for like 15 years and I still feel like a beginner. I still am like, oh, I just do this one thing, whatever. And I've actually done a lot of work around that and tried to, someone said to me not that long ago, I was talking about this and she said, I was like, who wants my subpar version of a Taylor Swift song? And she was like, well, but it's a special version. It's like the version for those people in that room at that moment. And that's what's cool about it. And I was like, wow, that's a paradigm shifter for me,
Yeah, I love looking at it like that. It's for that unique moment in time for the people that are in that room. And it's your rendition of it. There is no other Jennifer Keishin Armstrong's rendition of Taylor Swift. Like the world knows it. The world.
Why not? They can sing, and there's something happening in that room. I'm not saying I'm going to put out a record of that, but and expect it to take, and expect it to take off on Spotify. But that there's something special about sharing, like, I love this song, I hope you do too. There's something special about they can sing along with me in that room, in that moment. They can come up to me afterwards and be like, I love that song too. That's
Yeah.
something. And I think we don't think about creative endeavors that way enough as adults because we want to like professionalize everything.
Yeah.
And that has helped me a lot in like doing a thing that I am not the best at, like not aiming to be one of the greatest people at this thing. It's just doing it for the joy of it it has been really
Yeah.
liberating.
Doing it for the joy of it
Yeah.
is a really good way to put it. Because I always say, oh, I'm just doing it for fun. I'm just doing it for fun, or I just really love doing it. Like for me, I think like songwriting, one of my yoga teachers recently was like, I didn't know what I did for a living. And I made some comment about something that I do for a living, and she said, "Oh, music?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't do that for a living." And she goes, but music is your Dharma work. And
Mm.
I was like really, really taken by that. We live in a culture where it's hard to be a musician. And that's not to say that I haven't put all of my, blood, sweat, and tears into the songwriting and putting music out. Um, but I've always had another career, and have always continued to write songs and to do a little bit of writing. But I love that you bring up this concept, because I talk about this a lot in my course where I train sexology professionals. And one of the things that I train them on is showing up, like it can be on social media, it can be in blogs, but all of that is a form of creation, right? It can be writing their books, doing public speaking, whatever. But I talk a lot about what you're talking about, I think, is like that imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
essentially. And how do we break out of it? Like, how do we give ourselves permission to do those things, right? And like I was going to ask you this question. I had it in my mind. Well, we'll talk to Jen about her books, because I didn't introduce you at the beginning. I just kind of thought ADHD, but whatever. So Jennifer has written, like, I don't know, like 10 best-selling books, and I even just threw the 10 number out there.
I'm
But
on my ninth, so that was really
okay.
close. The
Okay.
one I'm currently writing is my ninth, so
Okay.
very close.
Yes. So you obviously don't have to give yourself permission around, like you said, writing these books that you write. You do it because it's your job, but you had to give yourself permission somehow to show up for these open mics when you'd only been playing guitar for like 3 or 4 years or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I was a super high achieving kid, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, I spent a little bit of time thinking I might be a therapist. Spent some time thinking I might be a pop star. That seemed highly, highly impractical. And I knew I wanted to be a writer pretty early. And then I decided, because I was a practical kid, oh, I'm going to be a journalist. I didn't know what was going to happen to the media industry, of course. So it doesn't feel that practical now. But in that moment, growing up in like the 90s, it felt like that's a like safe way to be a writer. And then, of course, no one's going to stop you from writing fiction or whatever if you want to. And so I very early decided this was what I was going to do. I went to journalism camp, which I think is one of the nerdiest things a person could possibly do. Like the fact that that even exists. I did that in high school. I was like the sports editor of my high school paper, and then I went to Northwestern for journalism school. It's like, and I was very focused on that's one of the best journalism schools in the country. So that's what I'm going to do. And so I was super hard charging. And I also, as I mentioned, during actually right before college and all through college, I worked for professional local newspapers. Not I did a little bit of the school newspaper, but I was mostly doing like already working for suburban papers during college because for one thing they paid. And they would let me do things like go review concerts because they actually loved, they were like, we want like a cool, hip, 20-year-old to go do this.
Right.
So I was just out there trying to make this happen from very early. And so I think when you're that, I mean, at least when I was that age, I just had like a chutzpah that, you know, it never occurred to me to be like, I can't do this. I shouldn't do this. I was just like, this is what's happening. So by the time I was in my 20s working full time, you know, it was kind of already like, I had already written many, many, many things publicly. And so, you know, I think that part made it so that I didn't have to say, you know, oh, it's okay that I do this. On the other hand, I wrote a novel that never, I mean, written a couple novels that never got published, but I took a real run at one. Hmm?
Yeah, I said
Yes,
never.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
actually true. I've been thinking about it again. And you know, I wrote this one that I actually got an agent for and everything. And I would say that was the one time I had a full-time job at Entertainment Weekly magazine. And on the side, I wrote this novel. Granted, it was a very like emotional experience. I did something ill-advised. I was writing very close to my own life as it happened kind of thing when I was canceling my wedding. And I wrote about a girl who works at an entertainment magazine who cancels her wedding.
Oh my God, I want to read that.
It's actually not bad. You might like it. It has its moments. And that didn't get published. So that is the one time that I think I mean, I didn't feel, I was, again, still very determined. And I had just moved to New York City and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a novelist, you know? So I was still, I don't remember thinking, oh, I can't possibly. But I did have to make the time, at least on the side, and decide that I was worthy, right? Think about the ego it takes to do things like this.
Yeah.
It actually is kind of like, people have asked me about this a lot, like students. And I'm like, to be honest, like, I think you have to be a little delusional to be, or something. I don't know if delusional is the right.
TikTok, right? They talk about that, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if delusional is quite the right word, but there's something almost off. It's off the norm is what I would say, right?
Yeah.
About someone like me and anyone who says the world should know what I want, what I'm thinking. The world wants to know and should know. That's a huge hurdle for some people, and it's hard for me because I don't know what it feels like to think the world doesn't want to know my thoughts.
Well, the funny thing is that, you know, I noticed this in people that live in certain places. Like, you know, I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, and in LA, kind of like sky's the limit, right?
That's right.
Move there, and that's the mentality. Like, what are you doing?
Yep.
What are you going to do?
How are you working on?
What are you working on? It's almost assumed that you're working on something versus if you're in somewhere else, a smaller town, perhaps, there's less of that. In fact, there's more of this sort of like negative stories of like, well, you can't do that. That's not for us. That's not for you. That's not for our kind of people. And it's generational. And so I often talk about how it's a thing that's sort of like generationally passed down. And when people then maybe move to bigger cities like LA or New York, and they're around this culture where people are doing and getting things done and things are happening, they come up against these stories because these students show up in my program. I meet them in the bands that I play with, because even though we're all practicing our craft and doing our songwriting and playing our music, it's still showing up when we're putting out the album, when we're in the studio and we're recording, when we're like, that doesn't sound very good. You know, like, we're judging ourselves on those stories.
Absolutely. Right? And you made me think, you know, I don't have a great explanation for how I bucked this, but I did come from a no, you can't do that place. I came from the suburbs of Chicago. I went to high school and lived in a place called Homer Glen, Illinois. And, you know, I think my parents must have done something to tell, you know, I mean, I was an only child for 8 years, is how I say it, because my siblings are much younger than I am. And I did get a lot of attention growing up in those first 8 years. And they kind of were like, you're a star, you can do anything. And that must have gotten in there because I did come from that place where everyone else around us was like, we don't do that. But when I moved to New York, I did notice a difference, because even just the people, like you said, around you, it went from kind of most people being like, oh, no, we don't do that, or you're just the special person here that does that, but we don't, to everyone just being like I started going to this, it actually, funnily enough, the novel that I wrote was a lot about this too. It was about a girl who in her late 20s who moves to New York City. And one of the things in it is that she sort of starts discovering this like little literary scene there, which happened to me. And that was the real catalyst for me in my life, is that I stumbled into this, just little mid-level scene of like constantly going to not book parties makes it sound so glamorous. I'm talking about you're in the back of a bar and somebody's reading their sad poetry while we all drink, and then somebody plays a song, and then you meet some other people, but then it turns out 3 years later, those people end up writing, best-selling novels and become stars. I loved it. I would be out
That is so cool. That's
all
what
the
I wanted to
time.
create when I
Yeah,
wanted rock and roll. Yeah.
that was, that was the catalyst in so many ways for me realizing like, oh, I don't want to get married and live in New Jersey and all of this stuff. I did meet boys too, and that was a factor. But only in the sense of them also kind of meeting me and treating me like, oh, so what do you do? What are you working on? Kind of thing. Like, and when I would say I'm writing a novel, people would just go, cool.
Yeah.
Instead of like back home where it would kind of be like, oh, that's weird, or like, oh, that's probably not going to go anywhere, or whatever, or oh, isn't that cute? This was more just like, obviously you're going to get an, oh, do you have an agent yet? Oh, as soon as you're done, let me know and I'll hook you up with my agent. It was very that, and just having that feeling of other people around me doing the same stuff and assuming that I would do it was a really big difference for me. And it's certainly how I eventually like ended up in the real publishing world in the, big five publishing world type thing with a big agent and selling books and trying to be on the bestseller list, and all of that really started in like back rooms of sticky bars in the East Village.
Wow. So to summarize, back rooms bars in the East Village, i.e. community. It's really important to have community of people that are not only doing it and not only supporting you, but also doing it.
That's right. And that's all we talk. And it just feels so romantic to me now. Do you know what I mean? Like when I look back on it, there were so many things that were very stressful about my life. I don't know how I had time for all this either, where I'm like working full time in a magazine and also, going out at night, and a lot of Pinot Grigio. And I always make the joke that like this was when we would eat Pinot Grigio for dinner.
Yes.
You have
$10 in your pocket. What's it going to be
and,
for?
And there's no dinner time plan.
Or you're going to get Pinot Grigio. Yeah.
Right. There's like no dinner time in this. You just go straight to the bar and then to the other thing and then to the other thing. And someone's like, oh my God, you have to meet this person and blah, blah, blah. And, everything that I have came from basically that time in my life, which is like Entertainment Weekly magazine was a huge factor for me because I write books about pop culture. I write nonfiction books about pop culture. And that's still a really pretty tight-knit community. I've gotten still many referrals and blah, 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 all that stuff from people I know from then. And also the people I met in those backroom bars. Like, one of the great examples of this is I became friends early with a writer named Jamie Attenberg, who has written many novels now. I think she's on 9 or 10. She runs the 1,000 Words of Summer program, which everyone loves. She's well-known, well-regarded. She's brilliant. And, we used to just like go out every Friday night and drink. And she had these great rooftop parties where she was a real connector and she would invite all of these other writers. And I just met so many people. And eventually, the first agent I got through a writing class, the dream, really. But the second, that didn't work out. And not the second, it's really my fourth agent, but the one who worked out ultimately, who I still have to this day. I met because I met an agent at one of Jamie's parties who was dating a friend of Jamie's, and we became friends. And she was like, well, I don't want to represent you, but she introduced me to one of her colleagues who became my agent. So this is how stuff happens. Like, it could seem icky to people from the outside that it's like who, but it's also, as you said, there's also, it doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like community. These weren't like, operators. We weren't all trying to like, do stuff. We were just trying to like meet people who were cool and were friends. And then we like to help our friends.
it's such a good reminder of, especially in this age where we're all behind a screen,
Yeah.
right? All behind a screen, that getting out there and meeting people and being in community, and you can have communities online. That's not to say
Oh,
that
totally.
that's definitely a thing now. Definitely wasn't before. Um, but that's the way it's done, right? You can send out as many submissions to,
Yep.
publishing houses, but it isn't about and have a great book, but your chances of getting this more like holistic, not even career, but like joy out of it, right? Is
Yeah.
when you're actually doing it because you love doing it.
Yeah, and the other thing, I mean, I think I remember saying this at the time, and certainly as I've taught classes since, when people ask me like how to break in or whatever, you know, there's so much so much more to be gained from helping other authors. There's a little feeling among some circles of authors, especially, it feels so hard. The stakes are so high with big books.
Mhm.
Everybody wants like big advance and the New York Times bestseller status and all that. And so that people can start to get very like, I'm not going to introduce you to my agent, and I'm not going to tell you what I'm working on. And I'm not, like they get very paranoid, and I understand that. But I've had so much better luck just sharing with people and helping people as much as I can. The publishing industry is hard. It doesn't, I was going to say it doesn't get easier. It probably does. I probably just don't feel it. What I will say is it's still stressful for me. I thought by this time I would, be able to write whatever I wanted and know exactly how it was going to go. And, I always say like every book kicks my ass in some way or another. And it's usually in a new way each time that I didn't expect. And so I love to tell
Yeah.
other people about my mistakes, because I would love for them to just actually be able to avoid them rather than make them
Yeah.
have that same experience that is very unpleasant.
So what would you say some of those mistakes
Oh
are?
gosh, I mean,
I
let's
mean,
think.
yeah.
Let's condense. I'm trying to like just go through some books, but I mean, a really good example, and it's the farther away stuff is, the easier it is to talk about
Yeah.
massive failure. Um, there's also a lot of pressure to act like you're super successful in this business in particular. Like, no, everything's fine, on social media and whatever. You don't
Yeah.
usually post like, oh, turns out my book's a bomb, you know,
Right.
bomb
Right.
emoji. You
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
do that.
yeah.
It's taken me time, and I have been talking about this online, in more recent years about books from the past. But like my first book was a total disaster because I didn't know what I was doing. I was hired to write this book about the 1950s Mickey Mouse Club, of all things. They were like looking for someone to do this. And I was like, I'd like a book deal, sure. It was with a big publisher. They were paying $100,000. And, I was like, let's do it. I mean, it turned out I had like a kind of inexperienced agent, and inexperienced editor, and me. And it was like blind leading the blind. We were all young. We were all trying to act like we knew what we were doing. And one of the crazy things that happened is the publisher, who was the one who had the idea for the book, died.
Oh.
And so it went from like, oh, everyone wants to make sure this book succeeds because of him, to no one cares about this book.
Mhm.
And no one told me that this had happened until afterwards.
Okay.
And I got no support. And that was one of the first big lessons from that, was just, I thought because you're with a major publisher that they would do things. And you
Right.
have to assume they will not, even if they've given you a decent advance, even if they are a big publisher. Most books don't get support, even at that level.
Right.
And so you have to go into it assuming you're doing all the marketing work.
Yep.
Which sucks because like I'm not a marketing expert, and I don't, but you have to. So from then on, I planned all my own stuff. And if they did stuff on top of that, it was a pleasant surprise. And I just treat them as like a printing company and a mailing company.
Mhm.
And that's it. And then if something else happens, I'm like, great, that was nice. But I
Yeah.
just assume now. So that's like a very good example. And these different things happen on each book. Sometimes I've had like difficult editing situations. Sometimes, I had one after my bestseller, Seinfeldia. Everyone assumed the next one would be an even bigger hit. It was about Sex in the City, and it wasn't.
Oh, it
And that
wasn't.
was really, really hard because
Mhm.
I had sort of had this like capitalistic whatever corporate idea in my head of like, obviously it only goes up, right? Only the trajectory should surely just keep going.
Right.
And it didn't. And that was a big hit to take. And it made me realize how much it's about expectations then, because that book did perfectly well. It just wasn't as big as the other one,
Wasn't
but
assigned yet, right.
yeah,
Got it.
so it becomes this game of like the expectations. If they're lower and you exceed them, you're like, yay. If they're too high and you don't. So you have to start to like figure out other like bars of success
Mhm.
besides those external things, I think is the biggest thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us about now. You just came out with a book. It's the Mean Girls one, right?
Yeah, I had a book about Mean Girls called So Fetch come out in January.
Okay.
And so that's kind of like the promotional cycle of that has kind of wound down. And I am now doing the thing I like the most, which is actually just writing, which is really nice. I'm working on a book about the TV show Parks and Recreation now,
Oh, I love that show. I love that
which
show.
will that'll be out. I mean, it's so weird how long the timeline is, but it's due this spring and then it'll be out the following spring.
Okay. And it's interesting because you do write about these shows much later, right?
Right.
Right. Like, so Mean Girls, that never really even made it to my radar. Obviously, Sex and the City was something that was big in the 90s. And you wrote the book Sex and the City, what, like late
That was 2018.
2018? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, this is very deliberate on my part because, first of all, a lot of times in the moment, it can feel like some show is huge and that obviously we'll be talking about it forever. And then that's kind of not true. And the opposite can happen as well. I would say Parks and Rec has been fun because that's a show that has grown in
Mm,
popularity after it was
yeah.
done.
Yeah.
At the moment that it was on, I wouldn't necessarily have thought I would ever write a book about it.
Right.
But shows have different kinds of lives now, especially with streaming. People can pick it up at any time. And so I'm really waiting, it's at least a decade, usually about 15 years or longer, to
Mhm.
see like, is this still something people even know or care about? Are they still excited about it? Is there a fan base? What effect has it had? Because a big part of what I do is kind of looking at the social impacts and the artistic impacts of these shows. And you really can't feel that
Yeah.
until a little bit of time has passed and you can actually see like, oh, TV went in this direction. It turns out Parks and Rec had more of an effect than I thought it did or whatever, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So that is usually why. Also, you want to just kind of like, you can never be totally safe, but the longer it's been, the more you're kind of sure like there's not going to be like a scandal about somebody. This is a big paranoia of mine
That's
now, is
a
like,
really good point.
I cannot have somebody getting me too'd and ruining this has happened with a number of things. And I will tell you a brief story, which it's not really a story, it's like 2 sentences. It's just that shows you this kind of thing. Right after Seinfeldia, I had deeply considered writing a Cosby Show book. And then it turned out there was this biography of Cosby coming out that I was like, okay, I'm not going to touch it. And then all the other things came out. And so I don't think anyone would want a book about that was like, wasn't this fun? Now. So it's like kind of nice to let time pass
Let
and
it simmer
hopefully
down and see where everything, let the
see
dust
where, and
settle.
they all keep making reboots now, which just can also ruin everything.
Mhm.
I can't stop that, but and in some ways it can be nice. It brings it back into the cultural ether a little bit. Sex and the
Yeah.
City has been a rough ride, but
Well, Sex and the City came back itself as a show, which isn't doing very great, I
no,
think.
that's what I mean is like that has not gone as I would have liked.
Yeah.
But, I don't think it's totally ruined it either. Some reboots can actually totally ruin the memory of a show. Um, I think we all still sort of love to watch it, even though I like hate watch it now.
It's
So
like we can't keep away from it. It's like
I will never stop. Like it's almost like when they keep making more, I'm like, oh, it'd be nice in a way if they stopped, because then I could stop, but I know I'm not going to stop till they stop. It's just something.
It's pretty cringe though, but I can't really stop watching it.
I'm glad to hear that you feel the same way. There's something about that show and those characters that women, I don't know if it's all ages or just our age, but like we like can't stay away from them, and we love to talk about that show, whether it's, oh my God, I hate what they're doing now, or I love it. There's just something there.
With them, right? Like we were in our 20s,
right.
and they were in their 20s, right?
Yeah.
And so now they're all in their 50s and 60s, and so are we. And so we're watching them. Maybe it's a sort of like, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna not do what Miranda's doing. You know?
That is, we definitely do not want to do what Miranda's doing. And which is such a bummer, because she was always the one we kind of wanted to be back in the day. I think that's been one of the biggest disappointments. So
well, and then Samantha never came back. I mean, that's probably
devastating.
The biggest disappointment to all of us, you know, especially in the positive realm. It was like Samantha was doing it.
Yeah.
Talking about, you know, all the things, the penises and the condoms and having lesbian sex and bathroom stalls. Like, she did the things, you know.
I know. It's just not the same without her.
So tell us, so you're writing about Parks and Rec now. That's a really good one. I'm trying to think, like, what else did I want to talk to you about? We talked to you about your most recent book, So Fetch. I guess, and you talked about your journey to getting published. What else can someone do, I guess, if they're feeling stuck, like, you know, in their writing? I guess I'll go here. Like, a lot of people want to write. So I work with a lot of coaches, therapists, and having like a self-help book even. It is almost like a business card for a lot
totally. A lot of people like to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. But then a lot of people feel like, that's not me. I can't write.
I mean, it could be, maybe it really isn't, is one idea. Maybe that's okay. Yeah. Because I do like to encourage that, just because it's like, because I do see a lot of this out there of like, you should do this and this and this and this. And I remember I worked once with a young woman who was trying to start a blog back in the day. And it was just so obvious to me that she didn't want to do this. Right. You know, she had clearly read somewhere or been told that this is what she was supposed to be doing. And so I would periodically be like, I know you're paying me, but like, seriously, I'm just going to say, maybe this isn't it, you know? And I think she just wasn't excited about the prospect or the subject. And the biggest thing is that you have to be into it. And so it's possible that if you really are struggling, you can, and sometimes you can put it down for a little while and then go away and then come back, and it turns out, oh, it's sort of started to come together in my brain. That's the second idea. So first of all, you could just not want to do it. And that's okay. There's a lot of things to do in life. You should do those things that you're excited about.
Yes.
Second of all, it could be that it's not time yet. I've had this with many books. I actually did start a novel before I started writing the Parks and Rec book, and I think I'll probably go back to it. I was struggling, but I think it's possible that like sometimes it just takes a long time to marinate, you know what I mean? And then all of a sudden one day you're like, no, this is it. Time is really big in general. I have found that with writing books versus writing like shorter articles and things, going from that, you know, many years of writing shorter things to writing these longer things, it's kind of annoying, but it's like, it takes a certain amount of time, and it's like a magic thing. It's not just literally you typing in the words. It's like, for a while, it's going to feel like, ugh, I don't know. There's always like a phase where I'm like, this isn't going to work at all. I'm going to have to give the money back. And then there's always a point at which suddenly it becomes a book. So sometimes it's just writing those shitty first drafts and not, you know, a lot of people resist the shitty first draft. Everyone's first drafts are somewhat shitty.
Often. That's something I tell everyone often, is just write something shitty,
you
right?
can't, you have to work with it. You have to have, it's like clay or something. You have to
Yeah,
like
write,
have it
write a
there.
bad song, write a bad poem,
Yep.
write a bad story.
Yeah. And it's so funny. It's like we've hit on this theme in this conversation. This is because you're a therapist. This is what happens. Things come out. But you said, going back to our original, what we were originally talking about. And to me, when you just said like write a bad song, I was just like, like that, I do have trouble with that. And again, I've decided maybe I don't write songs. And maybe that's okay too. But you do whatever it is you are really going to do and finish, you have to start. I just do, like, I'm in the middle of my draft process right now for my book, my Parks and Rec book. And even something nonfiction, I think people imagine that it comes out like beautiful and perfect, or, oh, it's just, you just tell the story in order. It's not. It's like, here, look at my transcripts. This is only just like a small portion of them. And I have to figure out how to put all that from interviews into like a readable form. And I've figured out ways to do that, but it's still, the first draft is like, I've been writing it right now. And I'm like, sometimes I write something and then I'm like, oh, I know that doesn't belong there, but I have to just keep going and be like, you know what, I'll figure out where that one belongs
You'll
later,
edit
or
it
I'll cut
later.
it or whatever.
Yeah.
But I have to just get it down. But it is my favorite part too. I love this because I love, like, you really get into writing to sit down quietly and do nothing. You're not do nothing, but not talk to other people.
Really get to do, and this is the stage where you really just get to just like brain dump, right?
Right.
Just
It's
put it all out.
exactly.
Get it all out.
Exactly. Someone somewhere, who I think is famous, said something about like the first draft is you telling yourself the story. And that's a good way of thinking it too. And it doesn't matter whether it's nonfiction or fiction. They're slightly different, like brain parts and stuff, but it still sort of ends up the same, which is I still have to get the story down in order in the way I personally want to tell the story of Parks and Rec. And then I will, and every time, like, this is the 9th time, so I have the advantage of just knowing that eventually something's going to snap and it's all going to come together and it's going to be a book out of nowhere. And then suddenly it's going to like rush out of my hands and into the world. And it's going to feel like no time has passed. But right now it just feels like, oh my God, is this ever going to get done?
Yeah. Well, you've had so much experience.
Yeah.
At this point. But you brought something interesting up that came up for me recently, was the idea of storytelling, and the idea that for me, I resisted writing poetry, even though I called it rock and roll poetry for such a long time. I was a songwriter and not a poet. And only recently something switched all of a sudden. And I was like, no, poetry is a valid form of storytelling.
Yeah.
And whatever form of writing or storytelling, like you're saying, that resonates with you is valid, right?
And whatever, and it doesn't have to be what other people think you should be doing. It just has to be, because that's even like with the songwriting, because I love playing and singing and I am a writer, a thing people like to say to me is, oh, you should write songs. And I'm like, but so far, no, so far I wrote, like, I used to write them when I was a kid, actually. Because I was probably less afraid, but I didn't know how to play them. So I have no recordings of them except the lyrics. And I did write one song once with Jeff Tweedy's book, How to Write One Song.
Okay.
I did it.
Uh-huh.
I wrote one song called Rose Gives Me a Headache. And that was the end of my songwriting.
That was the end.
I was like, this is it. It's as good as it gets. So
yeah. Well, I'm going to take it back to your college days of working really hard in journalism school and going journalism camp. You trained that little songwriter brain to write
right.
Journalist.
You're totally right. And also, like, what
weekly, and then
right.
pop culture books.
Right.
Yeah.
And what you're saying, also makes me think, like, and then one day I might wake up and be like, oh, I write songs now, like it could just, I think, like you said, all these different kinds of storytelling that we have, it can just resonate with your brain at different times. And it depends on what you want. Also, when you do a lot of writing for a living, part of why I took up music, to be honest, was because it physically, like, used my fingers to play the guitar. And so it was like the one time I got a break from writing and writing. You know, when I was writing my first book, I was writing it on the weekends and at night. And then I was writing all day at work. And so that was actually when I took up the guitar, because I was like, at least for this half hour that I'm playing the guitar, I can't be writing. So maybe that's why I really so far don't want to write songs. And maybe it'll change as my career changes.
Yeah. I love it. I love this conversation. This was like the best conversation ever.
I agree.
I'm so glad that we got to reconnect.
Yes.
And
it was so fun.
Yeah, and so fun. And maybe someday we will revisit our rock and roll poetry. Rock and roll, what was it called?
Rock and roll poetry open mic. Yeah. I think that was it. Yeah. It was so great.
Yeah. Maybe I'll come to the Hudson Valley and
Yes. We'll put on a one-time show.
That would be fun.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Jennifer, I'm going to do your introduction and I'll put it in the beginning.
Cool.
I'll introduce you. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Welcome to #Sexy Authors Podcast, a podcast about very important books and the people who write them, centering more specifically underrepresented communities such as sexual minorities, giving them a space to amplify their voices, their messages, bringing very important information to the forefront. In a time of banned books and worldwide chaos, #Sexy Authors hopes to offer intellectual refuge, respite, and connect you with these very important books. Hosted by sex therapist and author Moushumi Ghose, licensed marriage and family therapist.